Please make a welcome to Fiona Reynolds.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about beauty. Because beauty is a word that we all use all the time, don't we? If we're talking about a beautiful view or an experience or something we've seen and take delight in, we have no difficulty at all in using that word. But do you know, it's not a word that politicians use readily. In fact, they're almost embarrassed. And yet, whether we're talking about the beauty of landscape, the beauty of wildlife, or the beauty of our historic environment, you'd think it was something that politicians would understand are so important and meaningful to us in society today. But we've gone so far as even to substitute what I can only describe as sort of management speak words when actually we mean beauty. So ecosystem services is one of my favourite words to hate, but also even biodiversity or natural capital don't have that effect of making our hearts beat faster and to feel connected with something that we love. And yet, it wasn't always like this. Beauty as a word and as a concept and as a moral concept has been part of our society for as long as we've been able to talk and write about it. In fact, it was Chaucer that wrote, "It was the beauty of an April spring that longing folk to go on pilgrimages." Can't you just imagine longing to go as the catkins come out? And the early builders of our churches, this is Elkston just up the road, they could have built utilitarian buildings, but they didn't. They built beautiful buildings. Beautiful buildings which in some cases took so many hundreds of years to complete that they never even saw them, the craftsmen, finish. But they believed in beauty as essential. And whether we think about music or art or literature or poetry, beauty has coursed through the veins of British society for many hundreds of years. Perhaps best articulated by the Romantic poets and perhaps best articulated by Wordsworth, who himself picked up that idea of beauty having a moral purpose. He wrote in his lines written above Tintern Abbey, "To recognise in nature and the language of the sense the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul." So he saw beauty as shaping the very way that we approached life and approached our responsibilities. And of course, he was writing about the Lake District back in the early 1800s. This is a picture painted in 1820 by John Glover of Thirlmere. Now, Thirlmere doesn't look like that anymore, as you know. It's been turned into a reservoir about which a long history exists. But here, this is the Lake District that Wordsworth was writing about. But even as he published his Guide to the Lakes in 1810, he was pointing out the suburban villas that were creeping into the beautiful valleys, the extraction of iron ore, and the spiky larch, how he hated the spiky larch, introduced as a new species, replacing this beautiful deciduous woodland. And so, of course, it was him as well who fought the arrival of the railway to Windermere, and he wrote those words that no conservationist will ever forget: "Is then no nook of English soil secure from rash assault." And so in a way it was him. He is credited with being the father in many ways of the conservation movement, tipping from beauty being this positive force for good into a recognition that we need to fight for beauty. So tipping from admiration into defence. But if there was a rash assault descending on the Lake District, oh boy, was there a rash assault descending on our towns and cities. And this very famous cartoon by Cruikshank of 1829, London going out of town, or the march of bricks and mortar. And you can see the bricks pouring out of the kiln and landing on the poor hayricks running for their lives, the automaton marching on the fields, and these buildings, these terrace buildings, decaying almost as they are built. And that wasn't a made-up fact. In Sheffield, between 1831 and 1835, 160 new streets were built. So this was fast and terrifying, as well as the Industrial Revolution and the kind of smokes of polluted columns of smoke that were affecting everybody. And this was the truth, this was the reality, these decaying tenements, appalling conditions in which people lived, with no running water, families crammed into single rooms, typhoid and cholera, raging through the streets of our cities. And there was a public outcry about it, a public outcry that led, as many of you will know, to Edwin Chadwick's Royal Commission and many public debates. But part of that public debate was not just about living conditions, it was also about the absence of beauty. And out of the cacophony of concern came this man's voice for beauty, John Ruskin, a great art critic, writer, illustrator, philosopher, thinker, geologist, or whatever you like, a real polymath. But for him, beauty was of profound importance to society. He rejected mechanization, he rejected the way that industrialization was transforming our country, and he argued that beauty should be central to our lives. He was the inspiration, as many of you will know, for the arts and crafts movement, the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, and inspired many, William Morris and others, against this cause of beauty. He also inspired this young woman, my heroine, Octavia Hill, and she was a teenager when she first met Ruskin. She was teaching in a ragged school, and she used to walk the children out on the Saturday to Epping Forest from the centre of London, 10 miles, this is an extraordinary thing, in order that these children could feel fresh green grass beneath their feet, could breathe fresh air, pick flowers, and experience beauty. And she wrote, "The sight of sound and the sight of air and the freedom to walk are human needs, common to all." And when she grew up and began her great mission as a housing campaigner, she would build houses with little playgrounds for the children, or indeed, if there wasn't room for a playground, even a window box, believing that everybody has a right to beauty. And her vision was absolutely central to the whole way in which London changed in the later years of the 19th century. She was campaigning for London's open spaces. She called them open-air sitting rooms for the poor. And she joined with fellow campaigners. Here she is, much older by now, with her two compatriots, Canon Hardwicke Rawnsley, who'd really picked up the defender of the Lake District role from Wordsworth himself, and Robert Hunter, who was the lawyer and led the Commons Preservation Society. He was the brains behind the legal mechanisms to protect many of London's iconic green spaces, which would certainly have been built on Parliament Hill Fields, Hilly Fields, Vauxhall Park, had it not been for their work. And they got so concerned about the lack of legal protection for these green spaces that they indeed founded the National Trust, the organisation perhaps best known throughout the world for its passion for beauty. And I think it's important to remember that the National Trust in those days was not looking after stately homes. It was not the organisation we know it today. It was a campaigner believing in the right of every single person to experience beauty in their lives. They began to acquire small pocket-shaped bits of green space, actually many of them just outside London, and some vernacular buildings, but their passion was a deeply democratic passion for beauty. And indeed, one of their legacies, for which they're not well known, was actually the 1909 Planning Act, the very first Planning Act, which had as its vision the home healthy, the house beautiful, the town pleasant, the city dignified, and the suburbs salubrious. So again, a sense of the moral benefits which building beautifully could bring to every single person. And the government, in a way, began to listen to them through that Planning Act and through others. But as we all know, the First World War intervened. The chaos of a war that no one was ready to fight, the economic and social chaos which followed. But the people who were fighting that war did not forget beauty. And there are tragic stories of young men going to their deaths in the trenches with a pocket of A.E. Housman's A Shropshire Lad in their pocket. They knew what they were fighting for. And even Edward Thomas, who resisted signing up right the way through the war till the very end, and he was asked why he had finally signed up, and he stooped and picked up a clod of earth and said, for England's soil, for the beauty of England, that's why I'm fighting. And all of us know that he was killed in one of the very last days of the war. This immense sense of people sacrificing themselves, but doing so for the beauty and for kind of the essence of England. And as the war ended and government recognised that people had given so much, they promised, you may have remembered this, a land fit for heroes, homes fit for heroes, to put this situation right. But we also know that within years, within months almost, these promises had become hollow. And they'd become hollow because they came to a shattered economy, a society that was riven not only by losses from the war, but by the influenza epidemic. And there was a real sense that government could not deliver the beautiful England for which people had been fighting. But as we all know, when there's a vacuum of leadership, people are all too ready to step in. And the people who stepped into this vacuum and who triggered the next fight for beauty were indeed the jerry builders. And this is an extract from a very well-known book, this book by Clough Williams-Ellis, which was written in the 20s as the jerry builders just said, we're going to build houses for everybody along every main road, not much design content there, there was no planning, there was no strategic framework for any development, so there was ribbon development, urban sprawl, spilling out of all our towns and cities. And actually people hated it. Not just the sort of eminent architects like Clough Williams-Ellis, but the government hated it. They said it was a wasteful use of land. People hated it for these soulless new places that were being built. And there was a kind of real sense of the evils of sprawl. But it gave rise to this new movement, this new fight for beauty. People like Patrick Abercrombie, one of the very first planners from Liverpool University, who set up with others the CPRE in 1926. Clough Williams-Ellis himself was a great advocate for beauty. Some of you will know of his work, including Portmeirion in North Wales. And G.M. Trevelyan, the Regius Professor of History at Cambridge University, wrote a, no doubt, rhetorical pamphlet, "Must England's Beauty Perish?" he wrote. That same sense, actually, of Wordsworth's anxiety about the rash assault, this feeling that everything people valued was genuinely under assault. And this too persuaded the government to act. Slightly stronger planning legislation through the 1930s was beginning to emerge. But yet again, those efforts were interrupted by war. And yet again, beauty turned out to be absolutely central in people's conception of what the war was all about. These wartime posters, very well known. You know, look at this, not a bit of urban sprawl in sight there, is there? This kind of very, very romantic vision of the England that people were being encouraged to defend and to sign up for throughout the war. But this time, our politicians were determined that it would be different. Never again, they said, would people return to that sense of broken promises and a shattered economy. Never again would people feel let down by the government. And so even as the war began, Churchill, who was leading the wartime coalition, put together a post-war reconstruction committee, cross-party, cross-discipline, to plan for the future. And beauty was a central part of that future, which is an extraordinary fact. They were determined to meet people's material needs, for housing, for jobs, for all the things that would make, you know, life good after the war. But they were also determined to provide for people's non-material needs. They even used the word spiritual needs, which I think is a remarkable thing. And they built right into the heart of their plans. They built beauty. They commissioned reports on the future of rural areas, the future of the health service, social security, all of these reports that we know about. And then they put together a package. But of course, it wasn't Churchill, was it, who won the election after the war? It was Attlee. And I only put this picture up for one reason, so you can count the number of women in the cabinet. Okay, there is one. Here she is, Ellen Wilkinson, right at the end, who was Minister for Education. But yes, we've come a little way since then, haven't we? But nevertheless, lots of people credit, actually, the Labour government with this big post-war tranche of policy. And of course, they are to be credited with it. But the thing that I always find remarkable is that it was built on this consensus, this cross-party consensus that we did need a better world, we did need to invest in both new policies and practices for people's material well-being, but also for their spiritual well-being. And they talked about harmonisation of policies, words I would long to hear today. And so, of course, they did legislate for education, for health, for social policy, for jobs, for housing, but they also legislated for beauty. So they legislated for the national parks, and this is the Peak District, the first to be designated. They also designated for public access. And here, This is remarkable. This is John Silkin introducing the bill. This is a very foresight-led, this quote. He said, "The enjoyment of our leisure in the open air, the ability to leave our towns and walk on the moors and in the dales without fear of interruption are just as much a part of positive health and well-being as are the building of hospitals or insurance against sickness." So we think we've discovered well-being. They had it right back in the 1940s. And here is Tom Stevenson from the Ramblers Association leading a party of 6 MPs, 3 of them members of the cabinet, on a 3-day walk in the North Pennines on what was to become the Pennine Way. Well, I would love to take 6 MPs, 3 of them members of the cabinet, on a 3-day walk in the North Pennines, but I wonder, would they come? I'm not sure they would. And this is our problem. They were united around these goals. The same bill introduced nature protection for the first time in this country. This is Ben A, the very first national nature reserve to be designated. But they also, in the Town and Country Planning Act, introduced for the first time comprehensive planning for town and country. And within that, actually, green belts were a major new development. And this was very much about containing urban sprawl, this universally hated phenomenon, containing growth of urban areas and separating town from country. My goodness, where would we be without the green belts, I think, in this country? But they also knew they had to build housing, and this is a picture of Stevenage, one of the new towns in the post-war period. And although it's a very early picture, and, you know, people have their views about whether the new towns succeeded in all kinds of ways, but there's a little bit of Octavia Hill about this to me. You know, lots of green space, lots of gardens and trees, and a sense that where the government was committed to providing housing, it would do so in ways that gave people access to beauty and green space. I have to say it's been pretty much downhill since then, because that moment was the last time I can find in which people thought about beauty, not just about something over here that makes people happy, but something that was central to the way we think and plan and build our idea of the future. And sadly, there are many examples where public policy has just from that moment, gone in a direction which has been bad for beauty. But, you know, reigniting the fights, and for more years than I care to remember, I've been involved in those fights for beauty. And that's really what my book partly tells this story, but also the much more detailed story of some of these campaigns. So I'm just going to give you a little whisker of some of those campaigns and where we are today. So the first one is farming, actually. And this is the one thing that, you know, back in the 1940s, farming was a bit like this. Everyone thought, oh, it's fine. It delivers beautiful countryside. Its big problem is that it's in a parlous state, needs investment. And so the investment began, and it was mostly about intensification. So we saw, for example, the downlands of England being ploughed up for corn. We saw the Exmoor, this is Exmoor, the hills being improved for production of sheep to a much, much more intense level. In fact, a quarter of Exmoor was lost through intensification within 20 years of the park being designated as a national park for its moorland character. So the farming sort of imperative overtook the beauty one very, very quickly. We also, in the same period, lost 90% of our hay meadows, again to farm intensification. So this idea that farming was this perfect balance between food production and beauty was very quickly lost. And so that sense of change has been absolutely enormous. And the biodiversity crisis that some of us have been talking about this morning, very large part of it due to this farming intensification which swept through the country. And yet farming can produce beauty, and perhaps particularly in our pastoral lands. And it needs to produce both beauty and improved wildlife. We can't set land aside. We need, through farming again, to regenerate the beauty and the ecological health of our countryside. And maybe, with public goods for public money through Brexit, maybe we can do that. I think there's lots of people who are, the jury is still out, but we need to try, because when most of our farmland is in such a poor state, the opportunity and the need for bringing back that sense of harmony and integration is absolutely imperative. And I'm involved partly with the Food and Farming Commission we talked about earlier this morning, but also the Glover Review of Protected Landscapes, which is a big opportunity to do that. Trees is another. Now, trees should be fine, shouldn't they? Trees should be good. Well, not in the wrong place. And there were big rows back in the 20s as the new Forestry Commission began planting all over the precious Lake District. I mean, Wordsworth would be turning in his grave. He didn't like the spiky larch. So what he would have thought of the Sitka spruce, I have no idea. Well, I do, actually. I think he would have hated it. And in fact, there was an absolute outcry, big debates in the House of Commons about the evils of this planting in the lakes. And in fact, an agreement was reached with the CPRE not to plant the central lakes, but the Forestry Commission continued with their very, very determined plans to forest much of the hills. And in fact, back in 1980, my first campaign was a conifer plantation proposed to be plonked right here in the middle of the Brecon Beacons without any attempt to soften the edges or have mixed planting. This was still going on in the 1980s with, again, huge concerns about the ecological and landscape impact and public access too, chopped off without a thought. And of course, we've lost so many of our ancient woodlands in this country. The toll is one of the great sort of terrible stories of biodiversity loss. And indeed, we can still have arguments about trees, as many of us remember from the, I think, 2010, when the government decided it wanted to sell off the public forest estate. Remember that campaign? I have to say it was one of the campaigns in which I was involved, which reached a very climactic and very sudden end, because there was a debate in the House of Commons one day where the then leader of the opposition, Ed Miliband, remember him, stood up and asked the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, remember him, if he supported his right honourable friend's policy to sell off the public forest estate, which of course included areas like the New Forest as well as commercial plantations. David Cameron stood up, shut his brief and said, "No, I don't," and sat down. That end of campaign. It was quite extraordinary. I wouldn't mind a few more campaigns being as one as easily as that. But nevertheless, the idea that the government did not recognise the deep spiritual connection that we have with our forests, particularly our ancient hunting forests, was absolutely staggering. So this is another example where beauty had been written out of the script. Actually, we've done rather better on our coastline. This is an example of actually back in the 20s and 30s, before planning permission. Many of our coastlines were invaded by a mixture of caravan sites or development, Peacehaven on the south coast being a classic example, with no sense of the importance of the beauty of our countryside. Again, CPRE was the first to lead a campaign, and then along came the National Trust with one of its most, in my view, one of its most extraordinary and compelling campaigns, the Neptune campaign, which meant that the whole attitude to coastal protection changed, and the Trust itself protects nearly 800 miles of coastline, and extraordinary. Anywhere else in the world you go, much of Europe, much of the coasts of America, east and west, have been absolutely destroyed, a lot of it by tourism. We should be very proud. We can. But it took the voluntary sector to do that. It was a fight. It wasn't just something that happened. And I think this is, again, we've had to fight for beauty repeatedly. The story of roads is another one I can hardly bear to bring myself to tell. Roads can be, and I'm sure we all use them and we understand them, but back again in the 80s and 90s, this enormously deterministic policy of predict and provide. A road gets full, you build another one, it gets full, you build another one, and the government just seemed happy to go on that basis. And yet it was building roads through the most extraordinarily beautiful places. This, I think, was the bête noire of them all. This is the M3 extension through past Winchester, through St Catherine's Hill, which was just the most beautiful, tranquil place, full of wildlife, most incredible history and of real spiritual significance. And this was one of the, I'm sure you all remember Swampy and, all of the Newbury Bypass and Twyford Down, obviously, and all the rest of it. So this, in a sense, marked the kind of worst moment. But I have to say, when the government scaled back its road building programme, it was mostly due to the fact it had run out of money than that it had seen the light on beauty. And there are today many, many controversial bypass proposals. And still this idea, yes, we might be going electric, but we're not thinking about the number of miles we all drive and whether that's sustainable. And it even applies to railways. You know, railways should be good, shouldn't they? And this is HS1. Well, I say this because I was involved when this was built. This is the Channel Tunnel rail link through Kent. A great, someone who I admired greatly, Sandy Bruce Lockhart, was the leader of Kent County Council. And he said, okay, I get it. We're going to build a railway through Kent, but we are jolly well not going to destroy Kent in the process. It's the beautiful Garden of England. We are going to have public consultations along every inch of the way, and we're going to find the least damaging route for this railway to go. And indeed, if you look, it runs alongside the M2 for lots of its route. It sits pretty well in the landscape. HS2, by contrast, a line on a map, and never mind the consequences. And now you see everyone having to say, oh dear, the Chilterns is going to be destroyed by HS2. You know, how did that happen? Because they didn't think about beauty. They didn't even try to think about beauty. And there has to be a real question about the way that we're investing public money and losing. However good the outcome, and railways are good, but are we remembering those messages from that interwar period? Now, of course, underneath, a lot of these debates are about planning. And planning has a good name among environmentalists, but a bad name among many people. And one of the reasons is because it didn't always get it right. Particularly in the early days, this is an example of the post-war reconstruction of one of our cities where planning was just seen not to be thinking enough about what quality it did. And of course, many other examples of, you know, just the way we built all over the countryside without any sense of how it fitted into the landscape. But yet, for me, having worked, you know, CNP, CPRE, National Trust, planning was just at the heart of so many debates, and we fought off endlessly threats to weaken green belt protection or to, you know, reduce the effectiveness of planning in the countryside, endlessly fighting them off, until we got to this campaign, which some of you will remember. Again, this was in 2012, my last year at the Trust, where the government proposed to publish new planning guidance, which effectively said, and there were words in the draft, the default answer to any planning application should be yes. This was a red rag to a bull, because all that careful thought about how planning was there not only to stop bad things happening, but also to enable good things to happen in the right way and in the right place, thrown out of the window by that one remark. So the National Trust, perhaps in its most active ever campaign, I was very proud of it, but it's extraordinary. We had petitions at every property. We had people coming to express their concern, people full of admiration for the National Trust doing a rather Octavia Hill thing, I think, standing up for beauty for everyone. And, you know, we kind of won. I don't want to say we did win, because lots of people will say the NPPF is not good enough, and I am the first to agree with them, but it doesn't have those terrible statements in it. It did pull back from its very, very worst examples. And here we are delivering the petition to Parliament. It was a quite extraordinary moment. But yet, planning is key, and we have to get it right. It's absolutely central to whether we can develop in ways that are sustainable. And there are many examples. We can build beautifully in rural areas. This is not far from here, actually just up in the Cotswolds, where you can build using local materials and with references to vernacular structures and kind of provide something that it's meaningful as a place to live. You can also build beautifully in cities. This is a very famous development, the Arcadia development in Cambridge, near where I spend most of my time now, which was prize-winning development both for sustainability, for beautiful structures, and also as a good place to live for people, very much a place where people want to and enjoy living. And perhaps above all, we've got to get our cities right. I've always put Newcastle in here because it's one of my favourite cities, but most of us will live in cities, not perhaps everyone here, but if you think strategically about the future of sustainability, we need to make cities beautiful, walkable, with facilities within walking distance to create good places for the majority of our populations to live. And beauty will be a big part of that. A sense of pride and community is just as important for city dwellers as it is for our countryside. And so with the kind of crisis on our hands, the sense of a climate crisis, the sense, as we've talked, of a wildlife crisis, the sense that we talked earlier today of the food crisis, or the health crisis, we are at a point where we really have to think radically again. We have lost that sense of purpose and mission that drove through that post-war legislation. We need to recapture that. And yet, what do we hear all the time? We hear it's all about the economy, stupid, isn't it? Sorry, this is just a reminder that we might get somewhere. But it's all about GDP. We hear repeatedly from politicians, you know, it is just, and shopping is how basically what drives GDP. And, you know, we hear that, oh, it's been a wet June, no one's bought any more clothes, we're in crisis, you know. It's all around the economy. And yet GDP is a terrible way to measure success. It only measures income and expenditure. There is no balance sheet associated with GDP. And yet for us, all of us as environmentalists, the balance sheet is arguably the most important thing. Are we undermining our natural resource base, or are we enhancing it? And we know, sadly, what the answer is. So I've talked a lot, haven't I, about the government and about what it's doing wrong and, you know, all the frustrations. But at the end of the day, I think it's really about us. It's about us and the values we pass on and the environment we create, especially for the next generation. Remember Octavia and those ragged school children? Well, children today can spend between 6 and 7 hours a day on this, you know, whatever kind of device they use. Children today, the area over which they roam free has collapsed by 90% in a single generation. And a child today is 3 times more likely to be admitted to hospital falling out of bed than falling out of a tree. So I'm not advocating throwing children out of trees, but I am absolutely advocating a free-range childhood. And perhaps this campaign is the one of all my time at the Trust that I'm most proud of. This goes back again, it's a campaign about generosity, it's a campaign about everybody, it's a campaign about how we bring our children up today to love nature and to care for nature, because as David Attenborough said, people, you know, will only protect what they care about, and they'll only care about what they experience. And so we need to create an environment in which we all care about beauty. And so my final point really is that beauty matters. It isn't a nice luxury to have when the rest of society is all sorted out and our economy is swimmingly going ahead. Beauty is central to the way we think about ourselves, to the values that we hold, and to the way that society changes and can actually advocate for the non-materialistic things of life, as well as the materialistic. And so I'm going to join with John Muir, that great campaigner who set up the American national parks back in the end of the 19th century. He believed in the fight for beauty, and he said, it's not blind opposition to progress, it's opposition to blind progress. So that's why I'm trying to revive the fight for beauty, and that's why I hope you'll join me. Thank you very much.